What if I told you there's a new Marvel commander that wants you to play all the artifact garbage you can find and then uses it to power out a Ugin on turn 4? Ironheart, clever champion. For 5 mana we get a 3/4 flying artifact creature from the brand new Marvel set. And honestly, she was one of the few cards in the entire set that made me stop scrolling and go, wait, she does what? Our female Iron Man comes with the improvise mechanic, meaning that whenever we cast her we can tap any of her artifacts to help pay for her mana cost. And in this deck that's a very big deal because we will be controlling a huge amount of artifacts at all times. As a result, we'll always be able to cast our Ironheart for just a single blue mana. In most games we will have her online from as early as turn 3, and if we do get an explosive opening hand we will even be able to cast her from as early as turn 2. Now, because of how powerful Ironheart's second ability is, she will always be a removal magnet from the moment she hits the battlefield. But that is actually one of the reasons why I really like to get her into play from as early as possible. If she does survive, that's great because we will be able to do some completely unfair things from really early in the game. But if she does get removed, we usually baited out a removal spell and we will be able to cast her on a later turn by just paying the 1 blue mana and tapping all of the artifacts that we already generated, effectively allowing us to bypass any sort of commander text she might have. Now, what makes our female Iron Man completely cracked is her second ability, that will also give the improvise mechanic to any non-creature spell we cast. Most people will see this card in the command zone and they will think that you are running a traditional artifact deck. But Ironheart doesn't only care about artifacts, she cares about anything that isn't a creature. Crazy enchantments, big X-cost spells, expensive planeswalkers, and of course big non-creature artifacts. Basically, if it isn't a creature, Ironheart will help us cast it. And that's honestly what makes this deck so incredibly unique. Ironheart doesn't generate a card advantage, she doesn't create tokens, she doesn't allow us to recur cards from our graveyard, but what she does do is generate us mana velocity. Our goal is to simply flood the board with a bunch of cheap artifact X and artifact tokens, and then use all of those artifacts as a second mana base to help us power out the biggest spells that Mono Blue has to offer for just a fraction of their cost. And trust me, some of the things we are gonna be casting in this deck were never meant to be cast this early. And I'm gonna be honest, this deck isn't perfect by any means and it does have some vulnerabilities. Sometimes your commander will get removed at the worst possible time, and sometimes your opening hand just doesn't quite come together. But when this deck does its sting, it really does its sting. This list really rewards smart mulligans, proper sequencing, and understanding when you have to commit your resources. It can be a surprisingly difficult deck to pilot, but that's also what makes it feel this rewarding. Every time you play this deck, you will find new synergies and interactions you've never considered before. And for me, that's exactly what makes this Ironheart deck this special. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the list and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up into 7 different categories: the Artifact X, Artifact Generation, the Payoffs, card draw, support, protection and interaction, and the lands. And since in this deck everything starts with artifacts, let's begin with the X. These are cheap little artifacts that cost anywhere between 0 and 1 mana and will allow us to flood the board really early. And I must admit, most of the cards in this category aren't some sort of crazy synergy pieces that will win us the game on the spot. A lot of them are just included for one simple reason, and that's just because they are cheap artifacts. And in this deck, cheap artifacts are essentially free mana that will help us get Ironheart out from as early as turn 2 or turn 3. Welding Jar, a 0 mana card that will essentially up our artifact count for free and will help us power out our Ironheart really early, and later on becomes another artifact we can tap to improvise out our biggest spells. But unlike some of the other eggs in this category, Welding Jar also comes with a crazy potent effect, and that is that we can sacrifice it to regenerate any of our artifacts. And seeing that our Iron Girl is an artifact creature herself, later in the game this does give us a very efficient option to protect both our commander and any other high value artifact from removal. Dark Sphere. one of the older cards we're playing in this deck. We can sacrifice it to choose any source and then prevent the next half of the damage that source would deal to us. Now admittedly that is a pretty niche effect, but later in the game this little artifact can actually save you from getting smacked in the face by a Voltron player for 21 commander damage. And trust me, when that happens you'll be really happy you had this card sitting on the battlefield. Engineered Explosives, a very flexible artifact that we can cast either for 0 mana to have another free artifact on the battlefield, or that we can cast for 1 blue mana to make it enter with a 1 charge counter. And later on for just 2 generic mana we can sacrifice it to destroy any non-land permanent with a mana value equal to the amount of charge counters on this card. And this effect is a lot better than it looks at first glance, because even if we cast it for 0 and it has no charge counters, it does give us a way to wipe the entire battlefield of all tokens, which is just an excellent panic button if you are falling behind on the board against a treasure player, a Chatterfang player, or any other token strategy. Just be careful when you crack it, because this deck also plays its own fair share of artifact tokens and it will wipe your entire board if it isn't used correctly. Mishra's and Urza's Bauble, and I'm grouping these two cards together because they do serve exactly the same purpose. They're both 0 mana artifacts that can be sacrificed on a later turn to generate us a little bit of extra value. Mishra's Bauble will allow us to look at the top card of any player's library, while an Urza's Bauble will allow us to look at a random card in any player's hand. Neither of those effects is going to completely change the game, but a little extra information is never a bad thing. The most important part is that whenever we do decide to crack them, they will draw us a card at the beginning of the next upkeep, making them both into great early game improvise fodder that later in the game can just be sacrificed to help us dig a little deeper into our deck and find all of our payoffs. Paradise Mantle, another 0 mana artifact that does help us solve one of the biggest limitations of this entire deck, and that is having access to colored mana. Because while our commander gives us the ability to pay for some huge generic mana costs, she doesn't actually help us pay for the blue pips in any of the spells we cast. We can often set up some ridiculous artifact chains by just playing an egg and then tapping it to improvise out the next card, but eventually you will run into a situation where you have plenty of artifacts available but you simply don't have any blue mana left. And that's exactly where Paradise Mantle comes in, because for just a single mana you can equip this to any creature to turn it into a Birds of Paradise, allowing you to tap it for 1 mana of any color. And whether that's Ironheart or a random artifact token creature you have sitting on the battlefield, just having access to that 1 additional colored mana will allow you to make your storm turns last for a little bit longer. Herbal Poultice, an egg that we can sacrifice for 3 generic mana to regenerate one of our creatures. And obviously due to the mana cost, this effect is a lot less efficient than a welding jar. But later in the game, if you do have this sitting on the battlefield and a bit of spare mana available, you can use it as an additional way to protect Ironheart from being removed. Lodestone Bauble, another really old card from the Alliances set that somehow made its way into this deck. That does work in a really similar way to both of our baubles, except this card will require us to pay 1 mana to sacrifice it. Now the thing it does with basic lands really isn't all that relevant. We're just playing it because later in the game we can sacrifice it to dig 1 card deeper into our deck and go search for our win conditions. Darksteel Relic. Yeah, artifact eggs really don't get any simpler than this. It's a free artifact with the indestructible keyword. That's it. No card draw, no fancy effect, or no hidden synergy. Just a little artifact we can use as improvised fodder that will stay on the battlefield forever unless an opponent specifically decides to exile it. Tormod's Crypt. And unlike some of the previous decks we've looked at, this one actually does have a really huge impact on the game. We can just crack our crypt to exile one specific player's graveyard. And especially nowadays in modern day Magic, many decks are using their graveyard as a second hand. Whether it's a Sephiri's player trying to bring back their Elesh Norn, a Necrobloom player trying to juggle lands in and out of their graveyard, or even a Green Goblin player setting up for a massive Underworld Breach turn. No matter what happens, Tormod's Crypt gives us a really efficient way to totally destroy their game plan. Everflow Flowing Chalice, another card we can cast for 0 mana to just up our total artifact count, but later in the game once we do have our Ironheart on the battlefield we will be able to kick it a huge amount of times by just tapping all of our artifacts for its improvise cost, which then will make it enter with a huge amount of charge counters and we will be able to tap it for like 5, 6, 7 mana. And while this effect might seem kinda redundant because our commander is already fantastic at generating a colorless mana, she is also a removal magnet. So whenever the game isn't going according to plan and you don't have access to your commander anymore, Ever-Flowing Chalice will give you a way to convert all of that early game mana velocity that you built up into a permanent huge mana rock that you can use as a backup for your commander. And the improved version of this card is an Astral Cornucopia, another rock that we can cast for 0 mana but that does get a lot more interesting once our Ironheart is online, because we will be able to tap all of our artifacts to improvise out this card and it will enter the battlefield with a huge amount of charge counters. And in return we do get a thing that this deck needs the most: blue mana. As I've mentioned before, generating colorless mana with the improvise mechanic is the easy part. The real bottleneck for our artifact storm turns are the blue mana pips in all of our spells. And even just having 2 charge counters on this card can allow you to storm like 10 cards deeper into your deck and build a ridiculous board state. And the final 0 mana artifact in this deck is a Sigil of Distinction. Now I'll be honest, this is probably one of the weaker X in the deck and it's just here because it's a 0 mana artifact. But I suppose that later in the game once you do have like 7 gazillion mana available thanks to all of your artifacts, you can just improvise out this card and make it enter with a huge amount of charge counters and it does turn into a surprisingly threatening piece of equipment. Especially considering that our commander is a flying creature, so even boosting her power by 10 will only require you 2 hits to take an opponent out with commander damage. Now before we continue, there are a couple of really obvious cards that I didn't include in the deck. Cards like a Lotus Petal, a Mox Opal and a Mox Amber all fit this type of deck perfectly. But since all of these are really expensive cards, I didn't include them in the list, just to make sure that this deck was accessible to the average Magic player. But if you do already own these cards or you want to proxy them, I included the exact swaps in the Moxfield primer. Aether's Spellbomb, the first 1 mana egg that does come with some great utility. If an opponent does control a problematic creature, we can just pay 1 mana and bounce it right back to their hand, buying ourselves some more time and totally disrupting their game plan. And if we don't need the interaction, we can also pay 1 mana to sacrifice it and it will replace itself by drawing us a new card, giving us an artifact that never really is a dead card because at its worst it will just replace itself, while at the same time also giving us the option to prevent an opponent from winning the game. Conjurer's Bauble, a card that unlike our other baubles will cost us 1 mana to play, but it does have a pretty relevant effect, because when we crack it before drawing as a card, it will allow us to pick 1 card from our graveyard and put it back into our library, which will allow us to get back one of our key pieces if it did get milled, a key win condition that was destroyed, or we simply want to get another use out of a win con we already played. Conjurer's Bauble gives us a way to recycle it back into our deck, and one of the strongest 1 mana artifacts ever printed that does need very little introduction is a Skull Clamp. Later in the video you will see that we are able to generate a bunch of 1/1 artifact tokens, and a Skull Clamp allows us to convert those into a huge amount of card advantage. Just pay 1 mana, equip your Skull Clamp, the token dies, and you will get to draw 2 cards of it. Simple, effective, and completely unfair. And as a little bonus, even if this card is equipped on something, you can still tap it to help pay for the improvise mechanic, meaning that this card will always be actively contributing to our game plan even when we're not drawing cards from it. Chromatic Star, a card we can just play really early to use as improvise fodder, and in the late game we can just sacrifice it to draw us a card and add 1 blue mana to our mana pool, meaning it will essentially just replace itself while even refunding the mana we spent to crack it. Sol Ring. You simply can build a deck like this and not include the best 1 mana artifact ever printed. Usually our artifacts will contribute for 1 mana of our spells with the improvise mechanic, but Sol Ring effectively doubles that efficiency by tapping for 2 colorless mana instead, giving us even more of that mana velocity that I was talking about. And a Sol Ring will also make make it really easy to get Ironheart onto the battlefield from as early as turn 2, which trust me, whenever that happens does set up for some really crazy plays from as early as turn 3 or turn 4. Survivor's Medkit, and this might just be my personal favorite deck in the entire deck. For just 1 mana we get an artifact that has the ability to create us a food token, meaning we will get 2 artifacts for just playing a single card. And later on, once our engine is online, we can just invest another mana, tap it, and it will draw us a card without us even having to sacrifice it. Meaning that unlike all of the other eggs that we talked about, this one will just stay on the battlefield and we will be able to use it for improvising. And it also has a third activated ability that will allow you to sacrifice it to remove all of the red counters from a specific player, which can be really good if you are playing against a Necrobloom player that's trying to mill themselves with red counters from a Tato farmer, or that can just totally ruin the day of a Mothman player. And the final card in this section is a Sensei's Divining Top, an artifact that has been a staple in the Commander format for years. For just a single mana we get to look at the top 3 cards of our library and then rearrange them in any order we want, allowing us to set up our future draws and making sure that we will find the cards that we actually want to see. And if one of those cards happens to be particularly juicy, we can just tap the top, we get to draw that card and put the top on top of our library, meaning that even at its most basic level, a top will allow us to improve the quality of our draws throughout the game. And while that is a really nice thing to do, that's not actually the main reason why we're playing it, because as you will see later in the video, we are playing a huge amount of cards that will generate us value whenever we do cast an artifact. Once our Ironheart is online, we can simply tap one of our artifacts to pay for the mana cost of the top. It will then trigger all of our whenever you cast an artifact effects, and then we can just tap our Senseis, put it back on top, and do all of it again on the next turn. Next up we have our artifact generation. While the X will help us get our Ironheart on the battlefield, these are the cards that will take everything to the next level, because once our commander is online, every artifact we control will contribute to 1 more mana for all of our non-creature spells. So the more artifacts we can generate, the more explosive our turns will become. Let's start with one of the funniest looking cards in the deck and also one of the strongest, Clown Car. Noot noot. And yes, even though this card comes from an unset, it's totally legal to play in Commander. It's an X-cost artifact that whenever it enters the battlefield will allow us to roll X dice. For every odd result we get to generate a 1/1 robot artifact token, and for every even result, Clown Car will enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter, meaning that early in the game we can just simply cast it for 0 mana to have an additional artifact on the battlefield, but later in the game, once we do have a huge amount of mana and artifacts available, this card becomes truly ridiculous, because we will be able to improvise this card out for a huge amount of mana and we will get to generate a huge army of robot tokens. And seeing that these tokens are artifacts that will contribute to our improvising, things can get truly ridiculous on a later turn. Gilded Pinions, Gold Pen, and Prize Statue. The moment any of these cards enter the battlefield, they will generate you a treasure token, meaning that just by playing 1 card we immediately get 2 artifacts on the battlefield, which is exactly what we're looking for in this deck, because these cards do an excellent job at setting up some really explosive Ironheart starts by giving us a bunch of additional improvised fodder to work with really early. And while obviously these treasure tokens can be sacrificed for mana, often the correct play is just leaving them on the battlefield and using them to improvise instead, until we get to the later stages of the game where we desperately need that blue mana, which is exactly where we can cash in those treasure tokens. The Ooze. By simply tapping this artifact we get to exile a card from a graveyard and then generate a mutagen token, which is a simple artifact that for 1 mana and sacrificing it we can use to put a +1/+1 counter on any of our creatures, giving us a nice little 2 mana artifact that will just keep generating us more and more artifact tokens every single turn. And just like I mentioned when I was talking about Tugmod's script, every commander deck is using their graveyard nowadays, so being able to just exile specific things from graveyard while generating our own value is just a fantastic deal. And on a later turn, once you do have a bunch of spare mana, you can obviously crack these mutagen tokens to buff up your Ironheart and turn her into a legit threat, which is also where this card's passive ability becomes pretty relevant, because if any creature with counters on them would leave the battlefield, the Ooze will generate you that many new mutagen tokens, so you can just buff up your Ironheart as much as you want, and if your opponents do manage to remove her, you will just get refunded all of those artifact artifact tokens, which on a later turn will make it really easy to just improvise her out again for just 1 blue mana. Academy Manufacturer. Whenever we would create either a clue, food or treasure token, we will get to generate all 3 of those instead. And seeing that we're playing a ton of cards that will generate us these specific tokens like a prize statue and a survivor's medkit, value can get absolutely crazy on this. Because suddenly that treasure producing card won't just be generating you 1 artifact, it will generate you 3 instead. Essentially tripling up all of our improvised fuel generation. Now I will admit there is one very specific thing that makes this card feel really awkward, and that is the fact that it is a creature. Which means that unlike most of this deck, we won't be able to use Ironheart to improvise this creature onto the battlefield, which might make it feel really awkward to cast at times. But honestly, even getting a single use out of its effect generates us this much value that I'm really happy to cast it fairly. Forensic Gadgeteer, a 3 mana creature that whenever we cast an artifact spell will generate us a clue token. And as you've seen in the previous section, we will be playing a huge amount of really cheap artifacts. And this detective will then generate you a huge heap of additional artifact fodder if she isn't dealt with. Every act we now cast with this on the battlefield will give us 2 artifacts to work with, really increasing our mana velocity. And this card doesn't stop there, because it will also reduce the cost of any activated ability on an artifact by 1 generic mana, meaning that all of the clue tokens that it will generate for us will now be able to be cracked for just 1 mana, making them into really efficient draw tools. Worldwaker Helm. Whenever we generate any sort of artifact token, it will generate us an additional map token. And this ability does work with anything that we're doing in this deck. The robots from our clown car, the clues from Forensic Gadgeteer, and even the treasures of Prize Statue. Every time we're gonna be creating tokens, Worldwaker Helm will just simply give us 1 more, which means even more improvised fuel and even more mana velocity. And this card also comes with an activated ability that for 2 mana and tapping it will allow us to generate a token copy out of any artifact token we control, meaning that we can start copying robot, treasure, clue and map tokens, and every time we do so we will even get an additional map token on top of that thanks to the Helm's passive ability, making this into one of those cards that snowball very quickly if left unanswered. Mirrodin Besieged. Whenever this enchantment enters the battlefield, we have to choose 1 out of its 2 modes. Now 99% of the time we will be choosing the first mode that will generate us a 1/1 colorless mirrored artifact token whenever we do cast an artifact spell, which just like a Forensic Gadgeteer will generate us an additional artifact whenever we play one that we can instantly tap to improvise out the next spell, meaning that it's gonna be very easy to set up our artifact chain turns by just playing an artifact, then generate a token thanks to this enchantment, tap both of these artifacts to then help you cast the next spell, and if it's one of our big draw spells you'll see in a later section, you'll just draw into more artifacts and you can keep this thing going for as long as you do have the blue mana for it. And those mirror tokens aren't just improvised fuel, they also make for excellent chump blockers that we can use to just protect our life total while we're still setting up for any of our explosive turns. And unlike the previous token generators that I talked about, this card isn't a creature, meaning that once we do have Ironheart on the battlefield, we will usually be able to cast it for just a single blue mana. Every now and then there will be an opportunity where you can pick the second mode of this card, that at the beginning of your end step will allow you to loot, and if you do have 15 or more artifact cards in your graveyard, a target opponent instantly loses the game. And with us playing this many cheap artifact eggs that we will be sacrificing and constantly churning throughout our own deck, this is actually a really easy requirement to meet. Will it happen every game? Absolutely not. But the first time someone in your playgroup is taken out by a huge bunch of artifact garbage in your graveyard is a moment you'll remember forever. And a very similar card is Efficient Construction, which just like the previous one, whenever you cast an artifact spell will generate you a 1/1 flying artifact Topter token, setting us up for exactly the same benefits that I talked about with the previous card, the main difference being that the tokens that this card generates do have flying, meaning that you will be able to use your tokens to chunk down your opponent's life totals, or you can even use them as chump blockers to protect you from some big flying dragons. And if you do remember from earlier in the video, we are playing a Skull Clamp in this deck, which obviously just has an absolutely broken synergy with these enchantments that will generate us these 1/1 tokens. Next up we have our our payoffs. We've just spent our entire early game flooding the board with cheap little artifacts and getting our Ironheart online, so it's finally time to cash in on all of the mana velocity we generated. Some of these cards are massive powerhouses that were never meant to be cast from as early as turn 4, while others are just value engines that will take over the game all by themselves if left unanswered. And let's start off with the main win condition of this deck, Rise and Shine. For just 2 mana we get to animate any of our artifacts into a 4/4 creature. But let's be honest, that's not a real reason why we're playing this card. The real reason is that for a total of 6 mana we can cast this spell for its overload cost, which thanks to Ironheart we will be able to do for just 2 blue mana by improvising it out. And instead of just applying its effect to a single target, it will now affect all artifacts we control. All of our eggs, all of our treasures, and all of our clue tokens. All of those little pieces of junk that we have been hoarding throughout the game will suddenly turn into an army of 4/4 creatures. And trust me, the amount of power that this card can put on the board out of absolutely nowhere is just crazy. It's not all that uncommon for the spell to suddenly represent like 40 or 50 power on the battlefield. And the best part, this effect isn't until the end of turn. All of your artifact junk will remain 4/4 creatures forever, meaning that even if we don't finish the game on the spot, your opponents will be left with a huge army to deal with. And this card has a really funny synergy when you combine it with the Ooze, since all of your artifacts will now have 4 counters on them if your opponents are able to destroy them in combat, or by playing a board wipe you will just get to generate a huge amount of mutagen tokens in return. Simulacrum Synthesizer, an artifact that whenever it enters the battlefield will allow us to scry 2, helping us smooth out our draws on our next turn and just making sure we will draw into straight gas. Now the real reason this card is included and has such a hefty price tag is its second ability, that whenever any artifact with mana value 3 or greater enters a battlefield under our control will generate us a construct token. And not just any regular construct token, but a token that will get a +1/+1 stat boost for each artifact we control. And since we'll always have a huge heap of artifact garbage on the battlefield, it's not unlikely for these tokens to have like 15 or 20 power that will just scale further and further the longer the game goes on. And as you will see later, with all of the massive card draw spells we are playing, it's really easy to find our big artifacts and just overwhelm the board with these construct tokens, enabling us to generate an absolutely crazy board presence while just doing what we were about to do anyways in this deck, casting artifacts. Cyberdrive Awakener, a card that functions in a really similar way as a Rise and Shine, just animating all of our artifact garbage into 4/4 creatures. Now I will admit this card is slightly weaker than a Rise and Shine, because the effect only lasts until the end of the turn, and since Cyberdrive Awakener is a creature, we can't actually use our artifacts to improvise it out. Now that being said, this card being an artifact creature does come with a couple of benefits. First of all, it will also give all of our artifact creatures flying, making them incredibly hard to block. And nobody expects to die to an army of flying animated baubles. Since this card is an artifact itself, it's incredibly easy to use any of our tutors to get it just straight from our deck onto the battlefield. And unlike a Rise and Shine, this is a permanent card, so if it does end up in our graveyard, we will be able to use all of our recursion tools on it. So even if you weren't able to close out the game whenever you first cast your Cyberdrive Awakener, you can just get it back, recast it again, and go for a lethal swing. God-Pharaoh Statue. For 6 mana we get a legendary artifact that will make all spells that our opponents cast cost 2 more mana. And yeah, you heard me right. Not some specific spells, not non-creature spells, not the first spell they cast in a turn, but all of their spells. And trust me, in a game of Magic, this effect is way more brutal than I can explain to you in this video, because Commander players are constantly planning their future turns and in what sequence they will play their cards. Maybe they want to cast a mana rock and then follow up with a removal spell, maybe they want to deploy 2 threats in a single turn, or they might want to go for a combo and just close out the game. And a God-Pharaoh Statue just completely ruins all of those plans. Now the best part about this card is that in this deck we are going to be able to resolve it really early. Getting this bad boy on the field from as early as turn 4 really isn't all that hard to do in this deck. And when that happens, your opponents will just feel like they are frozen in time, making it nearly impossible to develop their boards. It's honestly one of those cards cards that technically doesn't win you the game on the spot, but if it does stick around for a couple of turns, it really does. Storm of Saruman. It's one of those cards that when I discovered it, I had to read 3 times because I couldn't believe that this card had such a potent effect. For a total of 6 mana, we get an enchantment with a Ward 3 that whenever we cast our second spell in a turn will allow us to copy it. And yes, that does include permanent spells, meaning we'll be able to use this effect on huge X-cost sorceries, creatures, and even planeswalkers. All we have to do is just play one of our little X first and then follow up with any sort of value creature or big game-ending threat. You can get 2 Academy Manufacturers, 2 Simulacrum Synthesizers, or even 2 World Waker Helms, which means that one of those will be a copy, and you will be able to use its own activated ability to start generating you even more helms and even more artifact tokens. But my favorite part about this card is that it explicitly states that a copy isn't legendary, meaning that we can use this effect on our big stone Big Daddy Bolus statue and we will get 2 copies of it and they won't have to be sacrificed to the legend rule. And thanks to this enchantment having Ward 3, it's usually pretty hard for your opponents to get this off the board before you can get some value from it. And probably the best target to copy with your Storm of Saruman is the next card, Ugin, Eye of the Storm. A card that's already completely capable to take over the game all by itself, but just imagine you having 2 copies of this shiny dragon on the battlefield at once. It's a massive 7 mana colorless planeswalker with some truly ridiculous abilities, but it doesn't see that much play because he does force you to play colorless spells. Now the first thing to note is that whenever we cast Ugin, he will immediately generate us value because we will get to exile any sort of colored permanent. And this effect happens not when he resolves, but whenever we cast him, meaning that even if our opponents are using counter magic, we will still get his trigger. And then we get to the best part of this card, his passive ability. Whenever we cast any colorless spell, we get to exile any colored permanent. And if you have been paying attention throughout the video, you will realize that this is just crazy. All of our cheap little eggs are colorless, most of our utility cards are colorless, and even a big portion of our win cons is also colorless. Meaning that once Ugin hits the battlefield, we can just start chaining our eggs together by improvising them out, and we will just be able to totally decimate our opponent's boards. Now on top of that, Ugin also comes with 3 abilities. His +2 ability will draw us a card and gain us 3 life, giving us access to a steady stream of card draw while also making him enter with 9 massive loyalty that makes him really hard to get off the board. His 0 ability will add 3 colorless mana to our mana pool, which we can use to activate some of our abilities or crack some of our clue tokens. And if we manage to get him up to 11 loyalty, we will be able to use his ultimate ability, which will allow us to search our library for any number of colored cards, then exile them, and we will be able to cast all of them for free. Yeah, this ability basically reads, you win the game. And outside being one of the strongest threats in this entire deck, this card just looks absolutely incredible. Because let's be honest, who doesn't like a big menacing spirit dragon planeswalker? A massive artifact we received in a recent Marvel set is the 10 Rings, which is an 8 mana card that makes our maximum hand size into 10, and at the beginning of our end step we will get to draw until we have 10 cards in our hand. And this thing does something very simple. It makes sure we never run out of gas, which is especially relevant in this deck because we'll constantly be dumping our entire hand of cheap artifacts on the battlefield. And if we then aren't able to cast any of our massive draw spells, we will be left with like 1 or 2 cards in our hand, which is exactly what the 10 Rings want, because the fewer cards we have in our hand at the end of our turn, the more value it will generate us, just allowing us to refuel our entire hand and then dump it again on the next turn. Now I can already hear some of you typing in the comments, but Panzer, doesn't this deck just lose whenever an opponent is casting an overloaded Vandal Blast? Yes, you are absolutely right. That is one of the biggest vulnerabilities of this deck. But thankfully we do have a solution for that. Darksteel Forge, a massive 9 mana artifact that will give all artifacts we control the indestructible keyword. And considering that 90% of the permanent cards in this deck are artifacts, that is a pretty big deal. From the moment that this card resolves, it will be incredibly hard for your opponents to ever be able to deal with whatever you are doing. They won't be able able to remove Ironheart, they won't be able to get your Simulacrum Synthesizer off the battlefield, and they won't be able to cast a board wipe on your army of animated artifacts after you just overloaded your Rise and Shine, allowing us to just continue doing our thing without ever having to worry about any sort of mass artifact removal. Before we continue, I want to give a massive shout out to all the YouTube members supporting the channel. These weekly deck decks actually do take a lot of time to put together in between doing research for the decks, cutting them down to 100 card lists and optimizing them, and then talking about them for multiple hours straight in front of a camera in my bedroom. And the support of the members is what makes all of this possible. So thank you all for giving me the opportunity to pour all of my love and passion for Magic into these weekly deck videos. And if you'd like to support what I do, you can also become a member yourself. You will get early access to the deck lists, exclusive Discord chat rooms where I'm always sharing what projects I'm currently working on weeks before the videos even go live, and of course that glorious Panzer helmet next to your name on YouTube. And while we're on the topic of support, I'd also like to give a quick shout out to Dragon Shield. If you're planning on sleeving up your own Ironheart deck or any other, you can use the code Panzer over on the Dragon Shield website to get a 5% discount. And saving a little bit of money on your sleeves means that you will be able to buy more actual Magic cards. Next up we have the card draw. One of the biggest downsides to playing this many cheap artifacts is the fact that our hand will run empty really quickly. Good thing for us that we are a mono blue deck and we do have access to some of the best card draw spells in existence. Howling Mine, a classic little group hug artifact that at the beginning of each player's upkeep will allow him to draw an additional card. But there's a neat little line of text on this card that most people forget about. Its effect will only work if Howling Mine is untapped, which usually isn't all that relevant because most decks don't have a reliable way to tap this artifact, but we have Ironheart, meaning we can simply start our turn with this artifact on the battlefield and get our additional cards, and then we can just tap Howling Mine to help it cast any of our spells with the improvise mechanic. So by the time we get to our opponent's draw steps, Howling Mine won't be active anymore and we will be getting a consistent stream of card advantage while giving our opponents absolutely nothing. And honestly, the best part about playing this card in the deck is making your opponents realize that this classic card has an additional line of text that they never knew about. Drown in Dreams, an X-cost spell that will make target player draw X cards or will mill target player for twice X cards. Now thanks to Ironheart we will usually be able to cast this spell for just a single blue mana and then use all of our artifacts to pay for the rest of the cost, meaning it's not all that uncommon for this card to draw us like 10 to 15 cards in a single cast, completely refilling our hand and giving us access to a ton of gas to just keep flooding the battlefield with. And that's exactly what makes X-cost spells this absurd in this deck, because most decks do have to generate mana in a normal way, while we just have to pay for the colored pip and then tap all of our artifacts to pay for the rest. And don't forget about this card's second effect, because it isn't just a card draw spell. Once we do have our Ironheart on the battlefield, we will be able to target both of its modes at a target opponent, meaning they'll first have to draw X cards and then mill twice X cards. And if you have a ridiculous amount of artifacts on the battlefield, you can use this as some sort of an alternate win condition. Just cast a spell with X being like 25 and an opponent will have to mill a total of 75 cards, which will instantly make them lose the game. Meta Magics, a double X spell that will make target player draw 2 to the power of X cards. If X equals 3 it will draw you 8 cards, if X is 4 it will draw 16, if X is 5 it will draw 32, and so on. At some point we're no longer playing Magic but we're doing our math homework, and if we are able to resolve this with a huge X cost, we will be drawing this deep into our library that we will be able to easily find any of the cards we can close out the game with. Just like a Drown in Dreams, you can also use this card as a win condition because it doesn't state that you have to draw those cards. Just cast this with X being 6 on an opponent and they will instantly be totally milled out and lose the game when they have to draw cards. Utros Research Craft. For 3 mana we get a spaceship that only requires 3 charge counters to unlock its first ability, which is incredibly incredibly easy for us to achieve thanks to Ironheart having 3 power, meaning the turn that this artifact does come down, we can just tap her and we will instantly have the ability active. And from that point on, whenever we now cast any artifact card, we will get to draw a new card and put an additional charge counter on our space station. And this thing obviously scales incredibly well with all of the cheap eggs we are playing, essentially turning all of them into cantrips on top of whatever card draw they are already providing by themselves, meaning that this card can quickly generate you an absurd amount of card advantage while also progressing towards its final form. And that's honestly the part I really love about this card. It will just keep growing in charge counters all by itself without any further stationing required. Once it does get to its final stage, it will turn into a massive flying artifact creature that will get 1 additional power for every artifact you control, making it function in exactly the same way as our construct tokens, except that this time it does come with built-in evasion, making this into both one of the best card draw engines in the entire deck that can also function as a win condition. And yet another classic artifact staple we are playing is a Mystic Forge, a 4-mana artifact that will allow us to look at the top card of our library at any time, and we do get the ability to cast any artifact or colorless spell straight from the top of our deck, which in a list like this can set you up for some really crazy scenarios, because every artifact we cast from the top has the chance of immediately revealing another that we can cast as well, and another, and another, and another, allowing us to set up some really crazy turns where we will be able to just keep casting cards from the top of our library. And especially thanks to Ironheart, we can just tap any of the artifacts we just played to help improvise out the next one. But what pushes Mystic Forge really over the top is its activated ability that for 1 life and tapping it will allow us to exile the top card of our library, which does sort of give us a way to deal with its own weakness, because if we do hit a land or a non-artifact spell on the top of our deck, we can just exile it and have a chance at another go. Tezzagret's Gambit. Now while this isn't the flashiest draw spell in this deck, it does have one very important thing going for it: a Phyrexian mana symbol in its cost, meaning that instead of having to pay blue mana for it, we can decide to pay 2 life, allowing us to cast this card for just 3 generic mana. And as I've already mentioned, the real bottleneck for this deck is having to pay colored mana, making any card that allows us to bypass that significantly better, because we will just be able to tap our artifacts to cast this spell and we won't even ever have to tap a land for it. Now while this card is mainly included to just draw us 2 cards for free, it will also allow us to proliferate, which I suppose is a really nice way to get an additional loyalty counter on any of your planeswalkers or an additional charge counters on things like an Everflowing Chalice or an Astral Cornucopia. Cerebral Download, a spell that for 5 mana will allow us to surveil X amount of times, X being the total amount of artifacts we do control, and then will draw us 3 cards. Now considering that we'll often be sitting on a pile of like 10 to 15 artifacts, this spell will allow us to dig ridiculously deep into our deck, allowing us to just toss any cards we don't need and setting up our future draws. And due to the fact that the draw will happen after we surveyed, we get immediate access to the 3 cards we did decide to put on top, making this just incredible to go find one of our win cons, one of our payoffs, or even one of our protection pieces. And just keep in mind that thanks to Ironheart, you will usually be able to cast this crazy draw spell for just 1 blue mana. Rush of Knowledge, another 5 mana spell that will draw us cards equal to the highest converted mana cost amongst permanents we control, which means that once Ironheart is on the battlefield, the baseline of this card is essentially pay 1 blue mana and draw 5 cards. And thanks to us playing massive permanents like a Ugin or a Darksteel Forge, this card has the potential to draw you even more. A very simple but completely unreasonable card for this deck. Another hidden gem I discovered is a Will of the Temur. The first mode will allow us to pick any permanent card on the battlefield and generate a 4/4 dragon token copy of that card. You can use it to get a second Academy Manufacturer, a copy out of your Worldwaker Helm, which you will be able to use its own activated ability on to start copying even more, and even if an opponent controls a really powerful card like a Field of the Dead or a big Elesh Norn, you will be able to get your own version of that. And the second mode, just like a Rush of Knowledge, will allow us to draw cards equal to the highest converted mana cost amongst permanents we control, which once again means at least 5 cards for a single blue mana whenever we do have our commander on the battlefield. And speaking of our commander, if we do cast a spell with our Ironheart out, we will actually get to pick both modes of this card at once, meaning this thing will just generate us some absolute absolutely absurd value for usually just 1 blue mana. And the final card in this section is a Thought Monitor, a 7 mana creature with affinity for artifacts that will draw us 2 cards whenever it enters the battlefield. Now, due to this card being a creature, we won't actually be able to tap our artifacts to improvise it out. But thanks to this card having affinity for artifacts, we will be able to cast it for just 1 blue mana anyways, giving us yet another very efficient way to get an additional artifact on the battlefield while also refilling our hand in the process. Next up, we have the support section. We've already covered the engine, the artifact generation, and the ways that we will win the game. The cards in this section are simply the glue that holds everything together. Whether they provide additional utility, additional value for our artifacts, or give us a way to tutor up specific pieces, all of these cards will make the deck run a lot smoother. Reshape. For double blue, X mana, and sacrificing an artifact, we get to search our library for any sort of artifact card with mana value X or less and put it straight onto the battlefield. A card that simply allows us to go fetch up whatever piece we need most at the current given board state. You need card draw, just go and fetch up your copy of the 10 rings. Need protection, just slam a Darksteel Forge onto the battlefield. And if you need a way to close out a game, just use a spell to go and fetch up your Cyberdrive Awakener straight to the battlefield. And while usually hardcasting a Cyberdrive Awakener is a pretty hard thing to do because it is a creature and we can't actually improvise it out, you will easily be able to tap your artifacts to improvise your reshape with X being 6, making it a way to bypass the restriction on a Cyberdrive Awakener. Sapphire Medallion, a 2 mana artifact that will reduce the cost of any blue spell we play by 1 generic mana. And while I did mention that colorless mana is never going to be a problem in this deck, just having access to some additional improvised fodder that will give a global cost reduction to everything we're playing in this deck is just way too efficient not to include. It will allow us to tap fewer artifacts to cast our biggest spells and leave them open to do other things. Cloud Key, a 3 mana artifact that whenever it enters the battlefield will make us name a card type, and obviously will always be naming artifacts. From that point on, all of the spells of the chosen type will cost 1 mana less to cast, which might not sound like much, but with us playing this many 1 and 2 mana artifacts, this thing is just crazy. We'll be able to cast a huge part of our deck for absolutely free, and whenever we do get them into play, we will instantly be able to tap them again to play the next card thanks to Ironheart's improvisability, making it incredibly easy to set up our artifact storm turns, especially once we have one of our draw engines like an Urtos Research Craft online. And as an added bonus, this card also does enable an infinite loop in this deck, but since I'm running out of recording time, I will include a detailed description of that over in the Moxfield primer so you can just read it at your own pace. Emry, Lurker of the Loch, a merfolk wizard that thanks to her having affinity for artifacts we will be able to cast for just a single blue mana. And when she enters the battlefield we will have to mill 4 cards, which might seem a little strange, but it does synergize perfectly with her activated ability. By just tapping Emry we get to target any artifact in our graveyard and we get the ability to cast it until the end of turn, essentially turning our graveyard into a second hand. We can just sacrifice any of our 0 cost X, then tap Emry and we will be able to get it into play for free again, which will trigger all of the synergies that happen whenever we do cast an artifact. We can use Emry to just recur any value piece we lost over the course of the game, and due to Emry milling us whenever she comes in, she essentially gives us some sort of pseudo card advantage, making her into one of the strongest recursion engines for any sort of artifact deck. Solve the equation. For 3 mana we get to search our library for any sort of instant or sorcery spell and put it straight into our hands. Now I'm gonna be honest, the main reason why we're playing this card is just to go fetch up our Rise and Shine and close out the game with it. But you can actually use this spell in many different ways. You can go fetch up a Will of the Teamwork to just instantly refill your hand, a Drown in Dreams or a Meta Magics to just mill an opponent out, or you can even use it to go fetch up any of the counter magic or interaction that you will see in the next section. A very versatile tutor that we will usually be able to cast for just 1 blue mana thanks to Ironheart. Tezzeret, Cruel Captain, a 3 mana colorless planeswalker, which in this deck means that we will be able to get him on the battlefield by just tapping 3 simple artifacts. Passively, whenever any artifact enters the battlefield under our control, we get to put a loyalty counter onto Tezzeret. And considering we're going to be constantly playing a huge amount of these cheap little artifacts and generating artifact tokens, the loyalty on this card can get absolutely out of control, which will make it really difficult difficult for your opponents to swing their creatures at them and get him off the board. His first ability will allow us to untap any creature or artifact we control, which occasionally will allow us to untap any of our artifact lands for an additional mana or untap a utility creature to get an additional use out of it. But what Tezzeret is all about is his -3 loyalty ability that will allow us to search our library for any artifact card that costs 0 or 1 mana and put it straight into our hand, meaning that Tezzeret is effectively a repeatable tutor engine that we can use to go fetch up all of the powerful X and low cost artifacts that we are playing in this deck. If you need to deal with someone's graveyard, just go and fetch up your Tormod script. If you need card draw or want to set up for an infinite combo, go and fetch up your Sensei's Divining Top. You think your opponent is about to cast a board wipe, you can use him to go fetch up your Welding Jar. And if there is a specific creature on the battlefield you want to bounce, you can use it to go fetch up your Aether Spellbomb. Whatever the situation calls for, Tezzeret will always be able to find you something useful while just thinning your deck in the process. And now it's time to talk about the best artifact card ever printed. Urza, Lord High Artificer. It's a 4-mana creature that whenever it enters a battlefield will generate us one of those lovely construct tokens that I did talk about earlier. Meaning that even before we start looking at the rest of what this card does, we already get a massive creature body on the battlefield. But where this card goes from strong to absolutely cracked is his second ability that will allow us to tap any artifact we control to add 1 blue mana to our mana pool, which is honestly even more ridiculous than Ironheart's Improvise ability. We can use the mana to pay for the blue pips in our spell's mana costs and even pay for any activated ability like our Worldwaker Helm or to sacrifice any of our clue tokens. And since we'll always control between 10 to 20 artifacts whenever we are playing this deck, if Urza then hits the battlefield, you will instantly gain access to a ridiculous amount of mana, making the things that this deck can do even more stupid. And if somehow all of those things weren't enough to convince you yet, Urza also comes with his own activated ability that does act as a mana sink. For 5 mana we get to shuffle our library and then flip the top card, which we will get to cast for free, which is just an excellent ability to dump all of your excess mana that Urza will generate you and that you can use over and over again to get a huge amount of free cards onto the battlefield. It's really not all that hard to see why Urza used to be one of the game changer cards. And obviously due to his absolutely cracked abilities, he also sets up for some infinite combo lines, which I did write out in detail over in the Moxfield primer. And now that we're on the topic of stable cards in blue artifact decks, we're also playing Tezzeret the Seeker, a 5-mana planeswalker that does basically everything we want in this deck. His +1 ability will allow us to untap up to 2 target artifacts, which might occasionally allow us to generate some additional mana with the improvising or just untap any of our utility artifacts. But the main reason why he's included is his -X ability that will allow us to search our library for any artifact card with mana value X or less and put it straight onto the battlefield, functioning in a really similar way to a Reshape, making it into a really potent artifact tutor that will allow us to just go fetch up whatever we need at a given time that will then stick around on the battlefield as a planeswalker that will continue to generate you value unless your opponents deal with it. Now those 2 abilities alone would already be more than enough reason to include Tezzeret in this deck, but his ultimate ability isn't really all that hard to get to and can function as a win condition. The only thing you need to do to be able to activate it is just use his +1 ability 1 time or cast something like your Tezzeret's Gambit. Whenever you then use his last ability, he will turn all artifacts you control into 5/5 creatures, making it function as another copy of a Rise and Shine that will usually win you the game from the moment you activate this. Next up, we have the protection and the interaction. Ironheart does tend to get a lot of attention once people realize what she's capable of, so having efficient ways to protect our own board and disrupt whatever our opponents are doing is incredibly important. Syncopate. One of the nicest things about Ironheart is that she does turn X-cost spells just like this one into way better cards than they actually are, because we'll be able to cast it for just a single blue mana and then tap as many artifacts as we need, making it act as a hard counter spell. And as a nice little bonus, anything that's countered by a Syncopate will get exiled instead of going to the graveyard, which is really nice, especially nowadays when everyone is running a huge amount of recursion. If an opponent is trying to cast their win condition, you can just use your Syncopate and they won't ever have access to it again. 3 Steps Ahead. A card with a spree mechanic, meaning that whenever we cast it we get to pay for any of the additional modes, and any mode that we paid for will apply. The first mode will make it act as a counter spell, the second one will allow us to generate a token copy of any of our artifacts, and the last option allows us to loot and just dig a little deeper into our deck. But the best part about the spree mechanic is that we can choose to use all of its modes at once, which thanks to Ironheart isn't really all that hard to do, making 3 Steps Ahead into an incredibly versatile piece of interaction that you can choose the mode of early in the game, or in the late game you can just go all out and pick all of its modes and it will generate you some crazy value for just 2 mana. Curse of the Swine. For 2 blue mana and X we get to exile any amount of creatures on the battlefield and turn them into 2/2 board tokens. And thanks to Ironheart's ability we will usually be able to cast this card for the exact amount that we want to just pinpoint remove any problematic threats on the battlefield and make it act as some sort of a one-sided board wipe. And since this card does provide us with exile based removal, you can even use it on indestructible creatures, any of the active Theros gods, or you can even use it to exile the Gravecrawler of an aristocrat's player and just prevent their combo loop from ever happening again. Lightning Greaves. The moment Ironheart enters a battlefield we can just instantly boot her up and give her both Shroud and Haste, which will make it incredibly hard for our opponents to ever get our commander off the board by using spot removal, which for this deck is incredibly important. But the best part is that even whenever the boots are equipped you will still be able to tap them for the improvise mechanic, making this card into both a great protection spell and into some sort of a mana rock. Now if you're not a fan of any of these Universes Beyond cards, I'm very sorry, because we are playing an actual sewer lit in this deck. For 2 mana we get an artifact with flash that whenever it enters the battlefield will give a creature indestructible until the end of turn, meaning that we can just cast our Ironheart on turn 3 and then leave her untapped together with any of our other eggs. If an opponent is then trying to disrupt our early tempo we can just tap him, improvise out this card on instant speed, and we will be able to untap with her on the next turn. And unlike most protection spells, this thing even leaves behind an artifact body that we can use on a later turn to get even more improvise value. And if Manhole Cover is the budget version, Mythical Coat is the premium package, because just like our sewer lit, it has flash and it can be deployed in response to removal. But instead of its effect only applying for a single turn, this equipment does stay on the battlefield and it will permanently apply its effect to whatever creature it is attached to. And obviously with our commander being a legendary creature, Mythical Coat will even auto-equip to Ironheart, meaning we can just simply leave 3 artifacts untapped, wait for one of our opponents to cast either a board wipe or removal spell, and then deploy this card in response. Override. For just 3 mana we get a counter spell that will force an opponent to pay 1 generic mana for every artifact we control, or their spell will get countered. And seeing that in all of our games we will be sitting on like 10 plus artifacts, this spell does act as some sort of a hard counter we can cast for just 1 blue mana thanks to Ironheart. Confirm Suspicions. A 5 mana card that will allow us to counter any spell and then investigate 3 times. Now I know, paying 5 mana for a counter spell is pretty expensive, but thanks to Ironheart's improvising we will be able to cast this as a regular standard counter spell for just 2 blue mana that will give us an additional benefit. Not only will it allow us to prevent any powerful spell on the stack from resolving, but it will also generate us additional artifact fodder we can use to improvise on a later turn. And the more premium version of this card is a Spell Swindle, which is also a counter spell we will be able to cast for just 2 blue mana, but instead of generating us 3 clue tokens, it will generate us treasure tokens equal to the converted mana cost of the spell that we countered, which honestly in a game of Commander is mana drain levels of efficiency, just allowing you to swim in artifacts that you can use to improvise out all of your big threats, while at the same time also giving you access to all of the blue mana you'll ever need. And the last card in this section is Erase the Palisade, a very unique board-wide bounce spell that whenever you cast it makes you choose a creature type, and it will return all creatures that aren't of the chosen type to their controller's hands. Now seeing that our Ironheart is a human hero, usually we will be naming the hero type with this effect, and unless you're playing against one of the new dedicated hero precon decks, this card will just reset the entire board and still leave your Ironheart active, just totally resetting your opponent's tempo and buying you a huge amount of time to go for an actual game win. And the best part about this card is probably the fact that it only has 1 blue mana pip in its cost, which as you know by now is the only cost we'll ever have to pay for this spell thanks to Ironheart just improvising it out. And finally, let's finish things off with our mana base. Being a mono blue deck obviously means that we are running a huge amount of islands, but we do have access to some fantastic utility lands. Academy Ruins and Buried Ruin. Both cards are land that for 2 mana will allow us to pick any artifact card from our graveyard and either put it on top of our library or return it back to our hand, which does give us a very solid form of recursion in the late game for any of our value pieces that we lost over the course of the game. If for example you already used your Cyberdrive Awakener and weren't able to win the game and an opponent removed it, you will be able to use these simple lands to just make it available to you again, and you will be able to go for another lethal swing. Archway of Innovation, a land that we can use to give the next spell we cast the improvise mechanic. And while obviously this effect is kinda redundant because we are playing Ironheart in the command zone, it can be quite nice as a backup tool for whenever your commander isn't available for you, and this card is actually one of the few ways that you can use to give your Cyberdrive Awakener the improvise mechanic, making sure you don't have to tap 6 actual lands to get him into play. Cephalid Coliseum. Once you do have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you will be able to pay 1 blue mana and sacrifice this land. When you do, it will draw you 3 cards and then make you discard 3 cards, allowing you to dig really deep into your deck. And due to the fact that we're playing this many artifact eggs that we will be sacrificing anyways, the 7 things in your graveyard requirement is actually pretty easy to meet. Fomori Vault. For 3 mana, tapping this land and discarding a card, we get to look at the top X cards of our library, X being the total amount of artifacts that we control. Then we get to pick one of those cards and put it straight into our hand. Now I can assure you, once you do get to the late game and you have like 20 artifacts on the battlefield, whenever you use this, you will find whatever card you're looking for. Mystic Sanctuary, a land that will enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 other islands. And whenever it does enter the battlefield untapped, you get to pick 1 instant or sorcery card from your graveyard and put it back on top of your library. Now the main reason why this card is included in the deck is just to make sure we can get back our Rise and Shine. Because let's say you cast it and you weren't able to close out a game and then an opponent wiped your entire board. Without this card in the deck anymore, it will then be really hard to close out the game because we aren't really playing that many other win conditions. Secluded Starforge. For 2 mana and tapping any amount of artifacts we control, we get to give any specific creature a +X0 stat boost until the end of turn. And this little land does actually function as some sort of a win condition in the deck, because later in the game, once you do control like 20 artifacts, you can just use its effect to buff up your Ironheart to more than 21 power, and thanks to her having flying, she will connect to an opponent and just instantly take them out of the game on commander damage. Uteros Titanic Godcore, a land that will enter the battlefield tapped and has the station mechanic, meaning we can tap any of our creatures to add charge counters on it equal to that creature's power. And once we are able to get it to 12 or more charge counters, we do unlock its final ability, which whenever we tap it will add 1 blue mana to our mana pool for each artifact we control. Yeah, whenever this thing is active, you won't even need your commander anymore, because it will generate you this much mana that you will just be able to hardcast any of the big cards we are playing in this deck. Now while getting this card stationed up might seem like a really hard thing because it would require you 4 turns with your Ironheart, the only thing you really need is 1 construct token that you have to tap once to instantly get this thing powered up. And of course, we're also playing the best magic card ever printed, a basic island, which we are playing a total of 24 copies of. And that's it for my Ironheart Clever Champion deck, a deck that takes a battlefield filled with artifact garbage and turns it into one of the most explosive mono blue strategies you've ever seen. Whether you're going to be drawing half your library with your X-Spells, locking opponents out of the game with your God-Pharaoh statue, or just decimating the board with your Ugin, this deck is capable of some truly ridiculous things. As always, you'll find the entire decklist in the description below the video, where in the primer I did explain all of the combos and even included some upgrade paths if you want to push this deck even further. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know by dropping a robot emoji in the comments below. Share this video with any Magic player you've ever met, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so you will stay up to date on all of the future deck decks. Anyways, thanks for watching, enjoy watching your opponent's faces when you play your Ugin on turn 4, and I will see you in the next one.